Hello and welcome to lecture number 40. This is topic 3.5, Disenfranchisement and Jim Crow laws. The first learning objective is to explain how the introduction of Jim Crow laws impacted African Americans after Reconstruction. We've mentioned Jim Crow in the past, but this will provide a clearer definition of what it refers to. The term originated in the 1830s as a derogatory reference to African Americans and developed from a minstrel character that embodied negative stereotypes. Minstrel shows were musical variety shows that were popular in the 1800s and early 1900s. This character was often portrayed by a white actor in blackface, and the minstrel shows that became popular in the mid-19th century were known for their demeaning portrayals of African Americans, and they were performed across the United States and even parts of Europe. In these minstrel variety shows, the actor would portray the character of Jim Crow as dumb, uneducated, and lazy. To add to the insulting nature of this character, it was usually portrayed by white actors donning blackface. Over time, the term evolved to refer to the laws that segregated public spaces based on race. The segregated facilities were often referred to as Jim Crow facilities, a derogatory name for anything associated with African Americans. These Jim Crow laws were passed both in local and state governments. They were primarily enacted in the South, though some northern states also had similar laws that divided public spaces, such as parks, pools, country clubs, restaurants, and hotels. These laws were a way for white society to enforce white domination and continue to keep African Americans in a second-class status. Jim Crow laws were upheld by the Supreme Court case Plessy v. Ferguson in 1896, which established the doctrine of separate but equal. This case was a significant setback for African Americans as it provided the legal justification for segregation. The case arose from an 1892 incident in which Omer Plessy, a man of mixed race, refused to leave a whites-only railroad car in Louisiana. These laws limited African American men's voting rights and by 1919 impacted African American women's rights to vote. They enforced racial segregation in various aspects of daily life. Many of the early Jim Crow laws mandated separate seating sections on passenger trains or in coach cars. First-class sections were usually reserved for white citizens, and even if a black passenger could afford a first-class ticket, they were forced to sit in second-class or coach cars. Segregation expanded into hospitals, streetcars, schools, and even cemeteries. In many cities, separate water fountains, restrooms, and waiting rooms became common sights. These divisions were meant to reinforce the idea of racial superiority despite claims of equality. Separate facilities were always labeled with signage designating white and colored spaces. In some cases, black citizens did not have access to separate facilities at all, such as in some pools or parks, which were simply off limits to them. The civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s began to overturn these Jim Crow laws. The process started with Brown versus the Board of Education in 1954, which declared the doctrine of separate but equal unconstitutional. This ruling marked a major turning point, but it did not instantly end segregation. Many southern states resisted the decision, leading to widespread protest and civil disobedience. However, the unconstitutionality of Jim Crow laws wasn't enough to change people's habits immediately. Congress had to pass additional laws to enforce equality in public spaces, culminating in the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 further ensured that the disenfranchisement of black voters could no longer continue legally. The Voting Rights Act also allowed federal oversight of elections in areas with a history of discriminatory voting practices. Other court cases in the 1960s helped dismantle the legal structures of segregation. For instance, in 1967, Loving v. Virginia struck down anti-miscegenation laws, which prohibited interracial marriages. At the time of this ruling, 16 U.S. states still had laws banning interracial marriage. This shows the widespread influence of Jim Crow laws across the South. The second learning objective is to describe the responses of African American writers and activists to racism and anti-black violence during the Nadir. The Nadir refers to the period between the end of Reconstruction and the beginning of World War II. This term was first used by historian Rayford Logan in his 1954 book, The Negro in American Life and Thought, The Nadir 1877 to 1901. Logan used the term nadir, meaning the lowest point, to describe the extreme racial oppression, disenfranchisement, violence, and legal segregation that African Americans endured during this period. His work highlighted how the progress made during Reconstruction was systematically rolled back, leading to one of the darkest eras in U.S. history for African Americans. One reason why laws and violence against black citizens were so pervasive and justified by white citizens was the rise of pseudoscientific racial theories like social Darwinism, which promoted the idea of racial superiority. These ideas were popularized by thinkers like Herbert Spencer, who misapplied Charles Darwin's theory of evolution to justify racial inequality. Economically, African Americans were trapped in cycles of debt through sharecropping, a system that continued to exploit their labor. The nadir also included some of the most flagrant public acts of racism in the U.S., such as lynchings and mob violence. Lynchings were extra-legal punishments, meaning they occurred outside the legal system. Victims were often accused of crimes they hadn't committed or no crime at all, and were subjected to public executions by vigilante groups. For mob violence, white mobs often attacked black communities, particularly on election days, to intimidate black voters and politicians. One of the most infamous examples of mob violence was the Wilmington Insurrection of 1898, when white supremacists overthrew a legitimately elected multiracial government in Wilmington, North Carolina. Black journalists and writers played a crucial role in highlighting the racism and violence at the heart of these events. The most famous writer of the era to tackle lynchings was Ida B. Wells Barnett. After her friends were lynched in Memphis, Tennessee for allegedly assaulting a white woman, Wells conducted investigations and exposed the true reason for their lynching was economic competition. Her friends owned a grocery store, and it had gotten to be so successful that it started to compete against the white businesses in town. After Wells published the story, a white mob tried to take revenge by burning her newspaper offices and printing press, but luckily Wells was out of town when this happened, so she escaped with her life. This incident prompted her to become one of the leading anti-lynching activists in the United States. Wells published her findings in works such as Southern Horrors, Lynch Law in All Its Faces in 1892, and The Red Record in 1895. Her empirical research and documentation of lynching statistics were groundbreaking, as she was able to prove that many lynchings occurred over fabricated crimes meant to keep African Americans subjugated. Her writing also sparked national and international attention, prompting debates about the role of the U.S. government in addressing racial violence. Black Americans across the country resisted Jim Crow laws and disenfranchisement through boycotts and other forms of protest. Between 1891 and 1910, African Americans in about 25 cities boycotted streetcar companies that enforced segregation. One of the earliest and most successful boycotts occurred in Richmond, Virginia in 1904, where black citizens refused to use segregated streetcars. In some cities like Atlanta and Augusta, Georgia, these efforts led to the temporary abandonment of segregation policies. African Americans also formed alternative transportation companies, though these were often less successful. Black-owned newspapers played a crucial role in publicizing these efforts and calling attention to racial violence. Major publications included the New York Age and the Indianapolis Freeman, both of which operated from the end of Reconstruction through the early 20th century. These newspapers were vital in shaping public opinion and organizing civil rights activists long before the more well-known protests of the 1950s and 60s. In recap, Jim Crow laws began as a derogatory term and evolved into a system of racial segregation designed to limit the rights and mobility of African Americans. The nadir, a period of racial regression, saw the rise of racial violence and pseudoscientific theories that justified discrimination. However, African American writers, activists, and journalists, such as Ida B. Wells, used their platforms to resist these injustices and lay the groundwork for future civil rights movements. Thank you for watching. If you would like to watch the next lecture, click the thumbnail on the screen. And if you would like more resources to help you study, you can visit apushslides.com/AFAM. I wish you the best of luck with your studies, and I hope to see you back on the next lecture.